Good afternoon. This seems to be all Russia Day at the Carnegie Endowment, but I'm Jessica Matthews, president of the Endowment, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you to this extremely interesting event, which we are pleased to be hosting the U.S. launch of the Baker Institute's new report, Russia and the Caspian States in the Global Energy Balance. I think everybody in this room appreciates how important Russia's energy diplomacy is. It's certainly its status as both a major producer and supplier has been a major factor in its push for renewed international power and status. But the global financial crisis has thrown a wrench into those plans and introduced new uncertainty both with respect to Russia's own economic development, its relations in its region and with Western Europe. So these are issues that are of long-term importance and of very short-term salience as this financial crisis unfolds. This event today is part of a long-standing collaboration between the Endowment and the Baker Institute. In March, our Moscow Center hosted the Russian launch of the report, and three Carnegie scholars, Martha Alcott, whom you'll hear from today, Nikolai Petrov and Lilia Shetsova in Moscow, were contributing authors to this report. So we are very proud to be a small part of the Baker Institute's work and to be partners in this effort. I want to just take a moment to welcome George Kroll, Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for South and Central Asian Affairs, who has joined this panel to add his insights on the report's finding. My job now is a great pleasure to introduce Ambassador Edward Dirigian, who is the founding director of the Baker Institute at Rice University. His career, I think most of you are probably familiar with. It spanned U.S. foreign policy from President Kennedy to President Clinton. He established one of our most distinguished records in international diplomacy with postings as U.S. Ambassador in Israel, in Syria, and Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs. So I don't know what he's doing here instead of being over at State Department making Middle Eastern policy. But more relevant to today's work, he was also the chief of the U.S. Embassy's political section in Moscow from 1979 to 1981. And so he brings a deep knowledge of Russian politics and foreign policy to this work. He was awarded the Presidential Distinguished Service Award, the Department of State's Distinguished Honor Award, and the President's Meritorious Service Award for his work in the government, and all of which widely considered as well-earned. So, Ed, it's a great pleasure to have you at Carnegie, and we are looking forward to hearing from you and from the report. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Jessica. Those very generous words. You know, Jessica mentioned that I served under 8 U.S. administrations from John F. Kennedy to Bill Clinton. That indicates to you how old I am. In the Middle East, we have a joke that I'm so old that I can remember when the Dead Sea was only sick. But with age comes some sort of belated recognition. Jessica, we are truly delighted to be here at the Carnegie Endowment, and we really cherish and appreciate the collaboration between the Baker Institute and Carnegie, both here and abroad. And we are honored to have the Carnegie Endowment host us this afternoon. The Endowment's outstanding work on Russia and the Caspian is recognized worldwide, and maybe more so this year, especially with several prominent scholars from Carnegie joining the Obama administration at high-level posts. So you have a human resource problem now. You have to recruit. I'm pleased to welcome you to today's Baker Institute presentation on our study, Russia and the Caspian States in a Global Energy Balance. In March this year, we first released our preliminary study findings at a major international conference in Moscow, in partnership with the Carnegie Moscow Center, as Erica mentioned. So it's no surprise that we return to Washington and Moscow on a regular basis to discuss this very important topic. This is not only because of our excellent long-standing research ties with the Carnegie Endowment, but also because Russian energy policy has been a major feature of the global oil and natural gas markets and remains a rich and complex subject to explore when thinking about future global energy geopolitics. Russia, as you all very well know in this room, the expertise in this room is very impressive, ranks among the world's most important oil and natural gas producers. When you include both oil and natural gas, Russia exports more hydrocarbons than Saudi Arabia. Given its large proven reserves, Russia has enormous potential to enhance its status as a global natural gas supplier. Whether through geography or geopolitics, Russia controls many of the major pathways for the export of oil and natural gas from its own territory and from other hydrocarbon-rich countries like those of the Caspian states. Last September, Russian Energy Minister Sergei Shmatka noted that Russia has such significant position in the high society of world oil, he said a Russian factor should appear. An intriguing statement. The Baker Institute study discusses what this Russian factor is, or should be. In his speech of last year, the minister mentioned the possibility of mothballing or shutting in Russian fields until prices rise again. Indeed, Russian oil production is expected to decline this year. However, the Russian economy, like that of other energy-producing countries, is under pressure from declining oil and natural gas prices, which raises questions about how Russia may respond if other energy producers react to falling prices by boosting output volumes to make up for lost revenues. Many countries, such as Iraq, Libya, and even Venezuela, have responded to the present situation by seeking a higher level of foreign investment. On the consumer side, new policies are being adopted in the United States and China to permanently slow growth in energy use. Europe is actively seeking to diversify its energy suppliers. The question is, what does the changing global energy outlook mean for Russia? The Russian Federation is a major player in global affairs. Energy relations have given Russian leaders an enhanced platform for international influence and created openings for Russia to assert itself on the international stage, especially in Europe, where Russia's pipeline networks terminate. Russia has consolidated its logical position in Caspian oil and natural gas transit routes. But at the same time, this development has also encouraged Europe to seek out alternative supplies more vigorously. In December 2008, the European Union, the EU, voted to offer $5.4 billion in grants to help fund natural gas and power interconnectors in Europe, including financial aid to the Nabucco pipeline, which would bring Caspian natural gas to Europe through routes that bypass Russia. In light of changing circumstances in the Caucasus and in the European-Russian relationship, now is a good time to reevaluate the United States' emphasis on pipeline diplomacy. U.S. Special Envoy for Energy Issues in Eurasia, Richard Morningstar, has said that pipelines are just part of the puzzle. Nabucco is not the holy grail that will solve the problem, unquote. Indeed, one of the conclusions of our Baker Institute study is that U.S. diplomatic strategies toward the region need to recognize that 2 decades of U.S. pipeline diplomacy strategies have neither significantly strengthened European energy security nor been fully able to diminish the Central Asian states' reliance on Russia as the main conduit for their energy exports. Consequently, critics have called for a new direction in U.S. policy toward the region. Indeed, European energy security could be much improved through a shift in U.S. diplomatic focus, we believe, to comprehensive conflict resolution in the Caucasus. The recent conflict in Georgia raised regional tensions to dangerous levels, and the Armenia and Azerbaijan also have to address their outstanding differences on Nagorno-Karabakh. While the United States must remain committed to democratic development in both the Caucasus and Eastern Europe, it would be wise for the United States, in partnership with EU member states, to take a more proactive role in conflict resolution efforts in the region. Moreover, the Baker Institute study recommends that these kinds of territorial questions should be settled long before NATO membership status talks move forward. Where progress is being made, the United States must support it. We are witnessing a historic dialogue develop between Turkey and Armenia, which could lead in time to the normalization of relations. Both countries must move forward in order to bring peace and prosperity on each side of the border. Analyzing alternative supply sources and transit routes for European natural gas will be a pipe dream until regional conflicts are addressed in a timely manner. In my view, conflict resolution is a vital part of enhancing energy security. Today, we have a major opportunity to discuss the future of the global energy market and Russia's important role in a mix of complex players and policies that will shape supplies and pricing in the coming years. Allow me to add that President Barack Obama has taken office at a critical juncture in U.S.-Russian relations. This is an opportune time to examine the areas where our mutual interests may converge. To this end, a renewed strategic dialogue between Washington and Moscow, certainly including energy issues, is long overdue. Resetting, not overloading, U.S.-Russia relations matters for many reasons. Reducing both countries' stockpiles of nuclear weapons is an important first step toward the distant goal of a nuclear-free world. Russia also has a major role to play in promoting peace and security in the Middle East, particularly on the Iranian nuclear question. That Iran does not become a nuclear weapons power is in the national interest of both Russia and the United States. A nuclear-armed Iran would upset the regional balance of power and open a Pandora's box of problems. Besides destabilizing the region, prompting a nuclear arms race, and posing a grave threat to U.S. allies, Iran's acquisition of a nuclear weapon could endanger energy exports from the Gulf. So it is critical that the United States work with Russia to ensure a positive outcome. At the same time, a direct dialogue between Iran and the United States that puts all issues on the table can really lighten fears that the U.S. looks to encircle Iran with hostile states on its borders. The United States and many of our partners and rivals in the world face an unprecedented range of economic crises and foreign policy challenges all at once. Russia is not excluded from the equation. It was very interesting when we had our Moscow conference. We had a dinner. I was sitting next to Oleg Deripaska, who at one point was the richest man in Russia. His net worth had considerably decreased at dinner time, and I found him much more humble than Deripaska. He was very soft-spoken. For the first time in 10 years, Russia's 2009 budget forecasts a deficit at 7.4% of gross domestic product. Furthermore, as Prime Minister Putin announced in mid-March, more than half of the government's reserve fund will be spent coping with the country's economic current woes. What is more, Russian energy companies have also accumulated massive debts, putting Russia's own domestic oil and natural gas production at risk. Clearly, in this global financial and economic crisis, all countries are affected, and solutions will need to be found cooperatively, not in isolation. The time has come to consider more robust reciprocity in European and Eurasian energy markets. When the Soviets invaded Afghanistan 32 years ago, it's hard to believe so much time has passed, and as Jessica mentioned, I was political counselor at our embassy in Moscow. That experience amply demonstrated to me how critical it is to manage our bilateral relationship with Russia, and to avoid misunderstandings. Dialogue with Russia is no less critical for U.S. and European energy security. And one of the points I'm making is that we cannot look at energy in isolation of the overall relationship. That's very important. You simply cannot have a unilateral focus on energy without the larger U.S.-Russian global relationship being put in the equation, and that's why I'm stressing so much conflict resolution. So I would like to thank all of you for taking part in today's discussion of the future of global oil and gas market. We look forward to receiving your feedback and input, and I want to really stress that, which will help us refine our analysis, and we welcome your comments to help us enrich our understanding of the complex forces that are shaping energy markets today. I also want to thank the members of the Baker Institute Energy Forum for their continued support of our programs and events, and again, the Carnegie Endowment for a rich and rewarding research partnership. It is events like these that constitute a critically important element in our ability to promote original, forward-looking discussion and research on the energy-related challenges facing our society in the 21st century, which we believe leads to a more informed and realistic public policy choices. Thank you very much. Amy?
Thank you, Ambassador Regent, and Jessica, thank you for hosting us today. I am going to try to sort of give a very overview, and so therefore I'm going to probably sound a little quick moving through these points, but it's a very rich study, so I encourage you, the papers, most of the papers are printed and outside today, and of course the whole study is up on our website. I'm going to start today by giving you the context in which we find ourselves in the energy market and think about Russia's foreign policy moving forward. It was very easy for Russia to forge this sort of link between energy and foreign policy as oil prices were going up and natural gas prices were going up and supplies were very tight. It's going to be a much greater challenge for them to create this so-called Russian factor in a market that is affected by recession and affected by financial crisis. And I'm going to talk about that today and how it's affecting their relationships with Saudi Arabia and OPEC and so forth. There we go. So my first point, which seems obvious today but wasn't obvious a year ago, is that the relationship between petrodollar cycles, banking financial crises, and the so-called oil cycle goes back to the 1880s. And even though there was a cottage industry over the last 3 or 4 years in saying that we finally got to the point where there's no more resources and we can see that and we can prove it, and so therefore oil prices are going to be high forever, and therefore countries should base their policies on that impending shortage. I think that what we're going to see over the next few years is that was actually incorrect, and that we're going to see the same cycle, a very similar cycle that we saw in the 1970s, where we're now having a financial crisis. And I will not talk at length about the link between the shifting all those petrodollars abroad and having them all come back as asset bubbles. That's another talk which we can come back and discuss when my book comes out in the fall. But the bottom line is we've been through this before. We're likely to be through it again. And I think one of the most interesting things that came out of our visit to Moscow this past March is that people in Russia forgot, and now they remember. And now they have to forget hitting the reset button with us. They need to set the reset button for their entire strategy, because it was based on these premises that China demand would grow forever, that a U.S. recession wouldn't matter, all these myths we thought that were going to keep us at 147 and take us to 200 without any economic impact. So this is just sort of a little diagram that shows you the sort of feedback mechanism so you can understand and think about what we're going through today. When we have economic growth, it brings a rising oil demand that brings the price of oil up. The industry can only respond so quickly because, again, it's a cyclical industry. Everybody runs out to get drilling rigs at the same moment in time. We wind up having a personnel and equipment shortage, and so on and so forth. Then suddenly the price of oil goes up very high. We've got this giant flow of our revenue, and our indebtedness goes up. We had this very dangerous situation last year where people were betting against the dollar and fleeing into oil as an asset class, which then became self-fulfilling, right? If I believe that the dollar is going to go down because the oil price is going up, and I bet on the oil price going up because I believe the dollar is going down. And it was very dangerous for the U.S. economy in general. And then, like many, Ponzi finance, speculative bubbles, it burst. And you could see that coming with the banking community's problems and so forth. So that's sort of where we are. And I think the interesting thing in thinking about this cycle, which has happened now several times, 56 crisis, 73, 79 crisis, and the current crisis, is that when you're the energy producing country and you've grabbed these rents for 2 or 3 or 4 years, you do not, quote unquote, win on getting economic benefit in a long-term way for your population. And this chart, I think, really illustrates it because you can see the gains that Saudi Arabians have made on a per capita income basis, and you can compare that to the gains that Americans have made or the harm that have come to Americans through these repeated financial crises. And you can see that if you were Vladimir Putin and Medvedev today, and you look at this chart, you have to ask yourself, is this strategy going to work for Russia? The other thing that happens every time we have a cycle, and it's easy to say now because we can all see it, and it was, you get heckled saying it, last year, but the bottom line is the oil industry is much more talented than people give them credit for, and every time somebody says we've run out of resource, and the most critical resource that people said we'd run out of, and I won't name names because now they look incorrect and that would be petty, is that we'd run out of natural gas in the United States. Hubbard's curve. Hubbard's curve, right? Everybody's talking about Hubbard's curve, and you've got all these analysts that you hear coming out of my state of Texas telling you that we've run out of natural gas forever. And what did the industry do? They've uncovered the biggest technical play in resources that we've seen, in a decade or two. And that is in this shale gas, which we're now seeing in the United States, expanding from what we originally thought was 145 trillion cubic feet play to maybe something that could be a play as high as 284 trillion cubic feet. Other people have higher estimates. And just to give you an idea of the scale, because I know not everybody, some people in here are Russia experts and not gas experts, a big and good LNG project needs 7 TCF. So we're talking about, I can't even do the math in my head, dividing 7 into 284, so somebody out there good at math will have to do that. The point is we are talking about a potload of natural gas here in the United States, and that is going to have a big impact on the global picture. And the interesting thing about that shale gas is that that play exists in Europe. And it exists in some interesting places, including, for example, the Ukraine or Hungary. And so the impact on Russia of this new play that has been launched by this giant boost in energy prices could be longstanding. So we looked at a couple different scenarios as part of this study. We have a computer simulation that looks at the global energy market and emphasizes natural gas. And so the first thing we did is we did a scenario of what would happen, really truly what would happen to the Europeans if Russia decided in 2010, we picked that year arbitrarily. I'll be honest, we started building the simulation before the second Ukraine event, actually even before the first Ukraine event. What if the Russians just decided, for whatever reason, to cut off Germany for 4 months? And the interesting thing about the results of the scenario, and if you look at the blue that's underneath the line that says 0, that is how much market share that the Russians lose. And so they get a big price impact for a year, year and a half, 2 years, but there's so much alternative supply out there that's sort of latent that in the end, for 10 or 15 years, they wind up losing their market share in Europe for quite some time before they can build it back. Now, Russia has, made these statements, and all you see these head of state visits about a gas OPEC, or a gas troika, or Russia, Iran, Qatar, and this picture sort of illustrates, where they think their leverage comes from. The red and purple color is where the resource is, and the white is where the demand is, and you can see sort of the complicated nature of what will someday be a global gas market, which is that the resources are not where the lights are on. And so therefore we have this big business in either pipeline diplomacy or liquefied natural gas projects. And Russia has tried to maneuver itself to look for so-called alliances, right? So if they, I used to tell people, if you think about this as like a pincher movement, right? I've got these possible competitors. Maybe the Libyans or the Algerians could compete with me. Maybe Qatar is going to compete with me. And we saw that during the Ukraine cutoff, that some of these countries had the capacity to sell spot LNG. And so you're Gazprom, and you've worked as a monopolist in your own country, and so you're flying around. And the question is, are you actually flying around to try to create a gas cartel? And if you were, could that be effective? So we looked at that too, and what we found was that there are really so many sources of competing supply that this is going to be very hard to do. And when we were at the Carnegie Moscow Center and met with Russian scholars and economists who study this themselves independently from the government, their modeling has shown the same thing, which is that Russia cannot win in this game of trying to corner the gas market. And even for scenarios where we, get Iran and Qatar to collaborate together with the Russians, which we're not really seeing. Qatar has announced its interest in building a LNG receiving terminal in Poland. But even if it were, again, the long-term result, our simulation shows, is that the three producers would lose their market share. And we would see more gas coming out. Ironically, the U.S. natural gas shale play is a big feature in constraining the leverage that these three producers would have were they to join together. And the other thing that's very, very interesting is the role that Iraq could play. And people, have sort of had Iraq off the table because of their problems there. But ultimately, the government is starting to focus on resource development. There's a huge potential for natural gas in Iraq. And what our simulations show is that Iraq has this very natural ability to build pipeline gas to Turkey and get to Europe. And if Iran and Russia were to collaborate together, Iraq gets the market. And that's a very interesting scenario in thinking about our policies and the sort of future geopolitics of energy and OPEC and so forth, is to think about where Iraqi natural gas might fit in the long-term picture. And then another thing that we've recommended in the study, of course, is thinking about, sort of future pipeline diplomacy and thinking about whether the existing pipeline diplomacy and the pipelines that have been built, have they really alleviated the problem for the Caspian or for U.S. interests. And we haven't really gotten very far. The Georgia crisis and all these other crises shows that still in all, these states have to go to Russia to talk about export routes. We've got China gaining a hand in the game by providing additional export routes that have indeed forced the Russians to pay the Turkmens and others a higher, more competitive rate for gas. And so maybe the United States, in thinking about European security, needs to take a different approach. Maybe we need to think about shale gas in the Ukraine and places where the current economics doesn't 100% encourage development because Ukraine has subsidized prices and some regulatory problems. Maybe we should be focused on how do we get shale gas developed in Eastern Europe, how do we support LNG receiving terminal in Poland and other places that would help us get more gas into the countries that would be most affected by Russian leverage. And we might also want to be thinking about since it was successful in oil, having a strategic petroleum reserve and a collaboration with Europe in oil, right, and with Asia. Maybe we need to be thinking more creatively about how we handle the financing of natural gas storage in Europe, or use what is very ample facilities in the United States for storage, since we're going to have a sort of a different natural gas business in the United States. Maybe we should be thinking about having a coordinated storage mechanism with the Europeans. Looking out to Asia, we did some scenarios. Again, the interesting results are that in cases where Iraq somehow doesn't come into the market, Europe would outbid Asia for Russian natural gas, and Russia would wind up having to supply more gas to Europe than Asia. And also, Russia winds up being much more focused on the European market if the Caspian developers are able to bypass the Russians and bring their gas to Asia directly, which we're really basically seeing now. And so one of the problems that the Russians have as a supplier, which they're starting to kind of understand, is that whereas Saudi Arabia is a global energy superpower because they can put their ships on the water and change their mind about where they're going to sell it and how they're going to market it and the volumes in which they're going to sell, Russia is tied as a regional supplier to one area, Europe. And when we were in Moscow, I think one of the interesting things that the scholars from Russia said is that part of Gazprom's concern is that if the EU ever became an incredibly unified entity, they would be a single energy supplier to a single energy buyer outlet. And we know what's happened with Turkey and some of the pipelines that ended in Turkey. When you have a buyer and they can say, oh, geez, you built this pipeline to us, but now we want to pay you less. When there's only one buyer, it's pretty hard to get your leverage. So the Russians can kind of see the picture to that, and I think that's why they've taken a very divide and rule diplomacy towards the European countries, trying to pull off those countries where their state monopoly or their national flagship company are willing to want to deal with Gazprom at the expense of the EU coalition. The last thing I'm going to talk about just very briefly, and then we can talk about it in the discussion stage, is sort of Russia's relationship within OPEC, because Russia is, of course, not an OPEC member, but they've been attending the OPEC meetings, and so it has to be a concern or an issue that one has to look at in thinking about Russia. What happens if Russia has a great unity with OPEC or with the Gulf? And what we're seeing is the opposite. That Russia's actions at the OPEC meeting were strain their relationship with the other OPEC countries. We see a quadrilateral conflict between Iran, Israel, Saudi Arabia, and Russia. Saudi Arabia is not satisfied with Russia's diplomatic position on the Iranian nuclear issue. Saudi Arabia has great concerns about that issue and its stability in its own region. And so they have sort of made it clear to the Russians in different ways, we'll buy arms for you, but only on the condition that you don't sell the same missile technology to Iran. They've tried to entice the Russians to not sell advanced missile technology to Iran. And then they have, in their own very quiet way, made it clear that if Iran does not come to the table for a diplomatic solution, the price of oil could be lower. And indeed, if you look at the dynamic where you have Israel very concerned for its own survival, I like to tell people we all watch television here in the United States and we see the conflict between Israel and Palestine on TV, and that is the focus. But CNN did not go in 2006 during the Lebanon War and show you the 1.5 or 2 million Israelis sitting under the ground in air raid shelters in Haifa, northern Israel, for 6 to 8 weeks. So you imagine if you were here in D.C. and you had to take your family and sit underground because maybe someone was selling Mexico some kind of missiles. You can imagine in Israel how the impact of having the possibility of either Russia or somebody else selling Iran missile technology would mean when you look at the conflict with Hezbollah from 2006, right? It's not just some paranoia. We're talking about a real conflict where there was a real threat of missiles, where people had to sit underground in air raid shelters. And so the Israelis have got to be thinking about, well, what is their, backup plan, right? And that this raises the risk of a military strike. And the question is, if you were Israel and you're going to make a military strike, what would you hit? So in the past, Israeli officials have talked about hitting Carnegie, the main Iranian oil export terminal, right? So you have this tremendous risk in the oil market. You've got Saudi Arabia and the Gulf Arabs having enough spare capacity now that oil demand has fallen, and you also have them having expanded their oil fields during this upward cycle. There's a lot of spare capacity in the Gulf that could be brought into the market if they don't see geopolitics going in a way that they're comfortable. The price of oil could go a lot lower. And in the capitals in Tehran and in Moscow, they have to consider that in thinking about their future pathway in dealing with us and the Europeans and the global community on these issues. So I'm going to stop there and open it up. We look forward to hearing Ambassador Kroll. You're going to turn it over to Martha?
Okay.
Yeah?
Thank
Please,
you.
go ahead.
Okay. I'm going to take over the mic now. Okay. It's really, before I introduce Ambassador Kroll, I want to thank Brookings Energy Security Initiative and the National Committee on American Foreign Policy and Central Asia Caspian Sea Basin Region Project for sharing George Kroll with us today and for joining our luncheon en masse. We're delighted to have you with us here at Carnegie and delighted to bring in Ambassador George Kroll, who's the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Central Asia, who will offer some comments in lieu of the wonderful luncheon address he would have given you. So thank you for coming and joining our luncheon instead.
Thanks very much, Martha. Ambassador Dirigian, and I see so many ambassadors and excellencies out there and expertise that I feel daunted that I can say anything, but I'm the Deputy Assistant Secretary responsible for Central Asia. In a way, this is like Central Asia because we're part of everything. It's like there's Brookings, there's Carnegie, and the like. We're in the middle. We're in everyone's backyard or front yard or the like too. And I think it very much dovetails into what Ambassador Dirigian had said. I was just a couple of weeks ago participating in a conference in Ashgabat that was devoted to the issue of energy security. And as the full title of it had, Reliable and Stable Transit of Energy and Role of Energy in Sustainable Development and International Cooperation in Ashgabat. And it was a very interesting time to be there in Turkmenistan and to listen to the various speeches that had taken place. Igor Sechin from Moscow came down and spoke a bit about the idea of having a new energy charter, and we look forward to seeing what the details of that would be. And I think that, first of all, I did want to pass on regrets from our new, and some might say old, special envoy for Eurasian energy, Dick Morningstar, who left last night to go to Prague in the Czech Republic to participate in the conference that the Czechs, as the EU president, are holding on energy issues right now. And he regretted that he wouldn't be able to be here today, but I'm sure that when he gets back, he does want to speak to all of you, either en masse or individually and the like. I think many of you know Dick Morningstar for his previous roles in energy and in other issues too. And I think this is another sign of the interest that the new Obama administration has in reaching out and in listening and in developing a policy on energy that is truly balanced and is one that is based on realism. I would say that as far as the United States policy towards Central Asia from the energy perspective, too, is that our policy, and I see many of our ambassadors who have been in Central Asia, John Ordway, and I think Steve Mann might be there, but that we have always respected the sovereignty and independence of the countries in the region, and we want to support partnerships throughout Eurasia, and will advocate as a government for those partnerships that respect the sovereign states in the region. And we also acknowledge the need for interdependence that facilitates trade and investment among countries, that the United States believes that a country's sovereignty and independence and prosperity are best enhanced by supporting the diversification of energy markets and transit routes, not only among the Central Asian states, but between the Central Asian region and broader international markets. But diversification doesn't come at the expense of the long-standing traditional trade ties, and rather we believe that diversification can enhance those ties and provide efficiencies. And at the same time, we continually want to highlight the potential for and the benefits of regional cooperation in Central Asia, which we will believe will foster the long-term durable stability in the region. And such interaction, we feel, can facilitate expanded trade and economic prosperity, coordination on the use of crucial resources such as not just oil and gas, but also water and minerals and other areas that are very much important to Central Asia. I would agree very much with Ambassador Dirijan that we have to look at Central Asia and this whole issue not in isolation. And as I know that the administration is looking at policies to Russia, to China, to Iran, and particularly as we have today and yesterday, Afghanistan and Pakistan, Central Asia is all part of all of that. And one cannot look at Central Asia simply from the prism of Moscow or Beijing or Tehran, or we have to look at it as part of the greater regional picture, which makes it endlessly fascinating for someone in my position, but also very difficult because it has to dovetail with what we're saying to Russia, what we're saying to China, what we're also going to be saying or should be saying to other neighbors in the region. So I very much agree that we have to be looking at this in a unity and realizing how our policies should dovetail. And as Dick Morningstar said, as you quoted, that pipeline policy is, only one piece of the puzzle, and that there are many other pieces that have to be looked at, particularly, for instance, upstream development in Central Asia, particularly in a place like Turkmenistan, which has enormous reserves which need to be developed, and looking at a policy for both developing those energy resources, but also getting them to markets in ways that do not provide conflicts and can actually be efficient and in ways that are secure, which was one of the big issues that was raised in Ashgabat when I was there. I would also say on the matter of larger conflict resolution that for Central Asia, it's not just resolving tensions in the other side of the Caspian of the Caucasus, but also on fostering stronger relations and a growing dialogue between the western and eastern sides of the Caspian as well. We encourage the growing dialogue, for instance, between Azerbaijan and Turkmenistan, which is, I think, vitally important as Turkmenistan develops its resources and brings them to market, to have a strong relationship. Kazakhstan already is exporting amounts of oil and looking at building its infrastructure for moving its resources across the Caspian, but to all points of the compass. As we know, the Chinese are building a pipeline from Turkmenistan that will also connect to Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan into China, which has been, as been mentioned, I think, an important new development and vector that shouldn't be seen as a zero sum for relationships that had existed for the past 70-some years. So I would say that our policy, as we are developing in this administration, from my perspective in Central Asia, is to look holistically at this and realize that also, and with agreement with Ambassador Dirijan, that looking at the larger political picture of fostering cooperation, fostering growing dialogue, resolution of the types of conflicts, or even if they're not hot conflicts, God forbid that they should become so, that is certainly a role that the United States can play with other interested parties, such as the European Union, as you've mentioned, and the regional powers, such as Russia and China. And that is something that we are engaged in with the EU, with Russia, with China, and as we are, as I said, we're talking today with Afghanistan and Pakistan, because that is also another route that has been mentioned and noted in the past to bring Central Asian energy resources, and not just oil and gas, but also electricity, into the growing markets of South Asia. One of the reasons why my bureau is the Bureau of South and Central Asia, because we look at it from a perspective of that part of a region and developing those connections. So again, I think that the report from the Baker Institute is a very important one, and I think it comes at a very important time as this administration is developing and its policies, not just on energy, but in each of these countries and in the region that I deal with, Central Asia. So thank you.
Thank you very much. We have a half hour left. We're going to break at 1:50 because the Brookings people have to go back. And there are other events that other people on the panel are part of. There's a big China and Central Asia conference, too, going on today. So I'm going to throw the floor open for questions and answers and ask that when you're recognized to give your affiliation. We have not stunned you all into silence. I cannot. No stupor. As you think of questions, I want to make a comment about what Ambassador Kroll said and then maybe turn it into a question for Amy as well. I think you raised an important point with regard to Central Asia, that when we talk about energy in the region, it's oil. It's not just oil and gas, it's hydropower producing electricity.
And renewables.
And renewables. My favorite, renewables, yes. And renewables and the whole question of energy efficiency. And that also carries into Europe. And one of the things that Amy and I are exploring in one of the papers on the shape of Russia's industry is how it's going to be impacted by the changing shape of Europe's energy market. And you alluded in your presentation to the fact that if Europe were to have a single energy policy, the EU were to have a single energy policy, it would change the whole shape of gas demand. What do you see as the likelihood of of the reshaping of the European market itself? I know that's not central to the study, but it totally shapes the whole question of the demand. And when we talk about future questions, that's one of the ones we've bandied back and forth a lot.
So let me just say we didn't study the European energy market in the study because we were looking more at the supply relations and geopolitics. But in thinking about the geopolitics, Russia has been able to maintain its leverage in the way to sort of assert itself or at least make itself appear or gain its sort of superpower status back through using energy as a lever. Really, as I mentioned, partly by siphoning people off and making alliances, and those alliances have played on the current structure of the European energy market. So there's a lot of power that comes from having your grid connected. If you think about, who was able to lead the European diplomacy on the Georgia issue, it was France. And I don't think that's a coincidence that France is a country that gets most of its electric power from nuclear. But imagine if France could trade that electricity across different barriers in the EU, and if Spain had hydroelectric, or we could move hydroelectric around the Caspian, it gives you flexibility to use different kinds of resources to respond to it when you have a shortfall in one particular kind of fuel in a particular time frame. The more flexibility you have to either move electricity across borders or trade natural gas across borders, the better off you are. And the EU has had a tremendous amount of difficulty navigating this issue. You've had entrenched interests in particular countries, especially Germany, who have fought against these sort of EU initiatives on integration, and they really have hindered themselves by allowing these entrenched interests to put on back burner sort of greater EU initiatives.
I see a hand there, and then
Charles Ebinger from the Brookings Institution. Amy, I was wondering, it's nice to see you again, incidentally. It's been a long time. I was wondering if you could give us any more detailed information on what the size of the Iraqi oil reserves are, and also any kind of estimation of what kind of capital investments needed to bring a sizable addition to the marketplace.
So Charlie, just to be sure I'm honest, you talk about oil and not natural gas.
No, I was talking about gas.
Oh, gas. So you know, the range on gas is very insecure because, you know, no one's drilled. So a lot of the gas that people believe exists is in the Western Desert, which of course is convenient in the sense that it's closest to Turkey. But like many things, before you drill, you don't really know. But people, you know, see it as a very sizable reserve, maybe comparable to some of the other Middle East countries. You know, in the, you know, tens of billions or hundreds of billions of reserves. And I think the point is that Russia has really had this sort of good fortune, which I don't think is accidental. And I've discussed this in Moscow with people in Putin's circle, and they've confirmed to me that it was not accidental. They have a great game going. They give military equipment in the past to Iraq and currently to Iran. We get hysterical and put sanctions on, and then Iraq and Iran can't compete with them in the European market, right? So we've ended that game in Iraq, so now the game is just, can we get Iraq stable enough to bring foreign investment into their sector? But in Iran, we have this very interesting opportunity today because, you know, we have a new administration, which is... And it is a very interesting little factoid. When the Russians had their Troika meeting in St. Petersburg between themselves, Iran, and Qatar, and people walked out of the meeting to make their announcements about what they're looking for from this three-way duo, three-way, you know, alliance, the Iranians came out of the meeting and said they would be very interested in having the Russians give them access to pipelines and markets in Europe. Well, you know, we're all here because, you know, the Russians have prevented that. I mean, they've had this very clever strategy. So if you're Iran today and you could have a negotiation with the United States and the EU that would be constructive, I mean, what's the carrot we have to offer? The carrot we have to offer is we'd like to let you transport energy from the Caspian, and we'll be willing to have your gas come to Europe in exchange for having a normal relationship with Iran. And you know, Ken Metlock, our other energy fellow, who is really the lead author on the natural gas study part of this study, had this line, he says, which I always quote him when I say it because it's such a great line. He said that Vladimir Putin was playing poker. He got a flush in his first hand, and instead of waiting for all of us to put down their chips, he yelled out, "Oh, my God, I've got a flush." And now we're all sitting around trying to decide how to bid.
This is a question for Amy. I'm Bob Abel from CSIS. Your report concludes that Russia's relations with OPEC are strained. Does it also conclude that OPEC's relations with Russia are strained? And if so, why?
Well, I can explain that in two different ways. There are a lot of people from the OPEC countries, and not just, you know, Saudi Arabia, but because obviously Saudi Arabia has no interest in having a rival in the Russians, and they see that in the oil space. They're not interested in having a Russian factor in oil because there should only be a Saudi factor in oil. But I think additionally, the OPEC countries spent a lot of time flying back and forth to make these deals with the Russians. And the Russians have never been forthright. In other words, the deal in OPEC is everybody has to cut production by a certain amount to get the price higher, and the Russians never make their contribution. But Igor Sechin came to the meetings, and I like to tell this quick thing, because when you go to the OPEC meeting, imagine a bunch of people sitting around a table, and the minister is in front of the microphone, and if he wants to seem like his point is very important today, he brings his delegation to stand behind him. And so the Saudis and the Iranians over the years have gone from bringing 5 people to bringing 25 people to stand behind the minister. So the Russians came to the OPEC meeting as a non-member. and brought 26 people to stand behind the minister. And the implication was, we are too important to be a part of your organization, but we are going to tell you what we want you to do. And this was very ill-received in OPEC.
I'm going to start taking two at a time so we have more of a chance of getting through the list. Harley, and then John Roberts. Okay. And then I'll take the next round. I promise. I have a long list of everybody's name.
Hi, I'm Harley Balzer from Georgetown University. I'm wondering if we could get you to say a little bit more about the conversations in Moscow. A lot of us over the years have found we could have perfectly sane discussions with academics and analysts, and when we got to the people higher up who were making phenomenal amounts of money off of this, it was a totally different conversation. You seem to be implying that maybe they figured out they have to play a better poker game, and I was wondering if you could say a little more about that.
And John? Take the mic.
A question for George Kroll. Relating to the actual formal subject of the conference in Ashgabat and to your comment about Medvedev's proposal for a new energy charter, we've just come through a massive crisis in Russia-Ukraine in which the energy charter never got cited, even though it was the obvious instrument to tackle with it. What kind of prospect do you think that there is for developing an international regime under which you can govern the transit of oil and gas in a manner that is acceptable to producer, consumer, and transit countries?
Well, a good and big question. I think it's what answer can you give to that, in the sense that I think that it was quite clear in Ashgabat when this was raised by the Russian delegation, there really wasn't much of a reaction to it because, first of all, it wasn't particularly fleshed out. It was interesting that it was raised when Igor Sechin spoke. It was in the session that was chaired by the General Secretary of the Energy Charter itself, that he had been criticizing on it too. So I think that this is an issue that to have a sort of an international charter and the like, I think requires coming to grips with some of the more fundamental issues of the relations among all the countries that are members of it, including, for instance, my own and the like, to see if there's a commonality of interests on it too. I think this is something that we have to look at and to see how far we can go. But I think, going back to what Ambassador Djurigian said, I think for it to be even realistically possible, it's the matter of getting to the issue of developing an environment and an atmosphere where there is a sense of some sense of either consensus, which I don't think exactly exists right now. And it's an effort of various countries. Like I said, in Central Asia, we have confronted issues of the zero-sum thinking on sides, that cooperating or diversification can be seen as a detriment to some countries' interests and like, and how do you get beyond that? I think has to be addressed before one can really sort of make advances on such a broad thing as an energy charter. I guess there has to be some agreement on some of the basic principles first.
So to take the first, to answer Harley's question, I think feeds right into what Ambassador Kroll is saying, actually. I think what's changed is that, the Russians had their very unique definition of reciprocity, but they've also started to think now about what does it mean to be an energy power in a little less simplistic fashion. And so you've seen since we've been to Moscow, you've seen these announcements of the Russians saying they're going to re-emphasize LNG. And the point is, how do they become a global player? Because they're not actually currently a global player. And if there's going to be shale gas in the Ukraine and other places, how's Gazprom going to invest in that and get that technology without some kind of European charter agreement that really defines reciprocity in a much more complex fashion?
I also want to throw in, and we are going to put a Chatham House rules version of this gas roundtable we had on the website. We're waiting for the report to be done, and this will go on our website as well and their website. There was the big difference between the experts and the oil companies was sort of presentation and bravado, not final analysis. And actually, the Russian experts they had concerns about whether Russia could dominate the European market at the current level of production, but they really had the same, I would say, positive assessment of what capacity was potentially for Russian energy companies and how their access to technology and their ability to engage in more difficult-to-work areas has changed over the last 17 years. And this was the biggest takeaway message I took both from their participation in the conference and in the roundtable the day before, the off-the-record roundtable the day before, that so much of what we look at the West, so much of our evaluation of Russia's capacity and where they're competitive and where they're not competitive is based on the structure of some of their corporations and what their technology was 17, 18 years ago. And it often takes a static, the transfer of technology question, and what they're able to get from service companies as well. And the experts, while being sometimes in ways that experts are in any country more cynical about their government's capacities or presentations in some cases, they were very upbeat of what capacity building Russia had actually engaged in. And if you took their advice, how they thought the Russian companies and Russian government should do things better, the end result that they saw was really a great deal of capacity that Russia was capable of. Now I'm going to turn to Wayne and Michael Rifkin.
Wayne Mary, the American Foreign Policy Council. I'd like to ask Dr. Jaffe to expand a little bit on our comments on Iran. I get the impression your study has examined how the return of Iraq to normal commercial relationships with the world will change things. Did you also examine what the potential would be for the return of Iran to something like normal commercial relations, the elimination or modification of current legal restrictions on American business in Iran? Because the 20 years of pipeline diplomacy to which Ambassador Dridjian referred was first and foremost anti-Iranian and only secondarily anti-Russian. Did your study examine what the world markets would be like if Iran, in some years in the future, were more fully integrated into them?
And if we get Michael Rifkin's question at the same time.
Thank you. My question is rather to everyone on the panel, because everyone spoke on resetting relations with Russia, which is the official policy of the State Department. But I don't understand exactly how it can be done without taking several things into consideration. Nationalism replaced communism as the main ideology. In order to fulfill that key ideology of contemporary Russia, the recovery of the sphere of influence in the near abroad is a key issue. Now, as far as Russia is concerned, the example of the Russian, let's say, position in the world is the composition of the Middle Eastern Quartet. You have the US, you have the European Union, you have the UN, which symbolically combines smaller countries which are or countries outside of European Union or of those, and you have Russia. Russia is equal in that sense to the European Union or to the United States. That's the idea of the Russian idea of a Russian place in the world. Now, in this, we are still playing with the idea of having bases on the or bringing into NATO areas of the near abroad. Now, how can you reset the button if we are sticking to the, let's say, our ideas of what I just mentioned? Could you explain to me?
It's wonderful not being in the government anymore. I can express my own opinions. It's a very intelligent question, very comprehensive and very deep, and it would take a seminar in itself to really debate all those issues. But one, I think you're absolutely correct that nationalism has replaced ideology. I think Vladimir Putin represents that in spades in Russia. And that one of their greatest geopolitical security concerns is the security of the near abroad and how they can maintain and hold their influence in the near abroad. I was very struck by a comment that Henry Kissinger relates that Putin made to him early on. And Kissinger asked him if what was the major concern that he had about Western policy. And Kissinger thought that Putin would say anti-ballistic missile defense systems and NATO. Putin said the near abroad and the potential forces of destabilization, including Islamic radicalism, Chechnya. We have South Ossetia. We have the territorial issues on the near abroad. Unstated was the eastern part of the Russian Federation, the big landmass in Siberia and China. And I think these are very legitimate concerns that I think that U.S. policymakers should take really into consideration when we're dealing with Russia. We have to simply put ourselves in their shoes, in their mindset, in the first instance, to try to understand where they're coming from. That doesn't necessarily mean that we have to agree with them. One of the greatest mentors I ever had in the Foreign Service, way back, was an ambassador by the name of Raymond Hare, who told me the first step in the art of diplomacy is to master your interlocutors and especially your adversary's position better than he can actually explain that position, and explain it to him so that your interlocutor understands that you understand where they're coming from, and then try to seek out the common ground. So I think the way forward, by the way, this is all in my book. Can I put in a plug for my book? Yes, Danger and Opportunity, An American Ambassador's Journey Through the Middle East, Simon & Schuster. It's worthwhile reading. Truly, this is the art of diplomacy that I wish in my long career I saw more of our administrations, be they Democratic or Republican, executing. One thing that encourages me about President Obama is that he seems to be in this mindset of first listening and understanding and then engaging. So I think this should be our approach. On the Middle East, I would go back to the model you mentioned. The U.S., the UN, Europe, and Russia are involved in the Middle East, which is such a strategic area, be it the broader Middle East, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Arab, Israeli, Iran. But we do have a precedent that I would encourage our administration to look at. When we structured the Madrid Peace Conference, of course, the then faltering Soviet Union was the co-equal partner, at least in symbolic terms, with the U.S. in bringing the Madrid Peace Conference together. In a quartet, Russia has a role for the roadmap. Now, what I'm saying is that Russia already has a precedent place in being a potential partner with us on major Middle East initiatives, and we should encourage that. I will not, even being out of government, give you my views on expanded NATO membership, because this is being webcast.
I would just like to say to the last question that as somebody responsible for Central Asia and have been to Moscow and talked to my colleagues at the Foreign Ministry as well as in think tanks and like about Central, and as someone who spent the bulk of my career in Russia and in the neighboring countries, Ukraine, Belarus, etc., you're quite right. I think when you press the reset button, this issue of dealing how you discuss the neighborhood is the most difficult that we've found. And finding the right language, I mean, I put myself in the shoes of my Russian colleagues and can understand almost perfectly how they feel about discussing this with an American representative. But again, and I find this also in the issue of my colleagues in the countries of Central Asia when we speak to them and how they want deal with us and with Russia about their issues, is that we, that is the United States, believe these are sovereign, independent countries, that we can have normal diplomatic relations and dialogues with them. And these countries want this with us, but they always know that they are part of a larger piece with a neighbor that has a cultural and political and certainly even a psychological relationship with them that we all have to deal with and work with. Finding that way to deal with it constructively and cooperatively is one of the biggest challenges that we face, certainly in the State Department, but we're not alone because our colleagues in Central Asia are living in that same environment as well.
I just want to throw in 1 second and then turn to the last 2 questions and give everybody, especially Amy, who has things to say about Iran, who got cut off from this, something about China, because one of the things we haven't talked today about is the growing role of China in the region and the growing role of China in the energy market globally. And they, I think, as we move forward, are going to be the biggest competition for Russia. I'm going to take the last 2 questions, and I'm going to give Amy back the floor to talk about Iran as well as answer the last 2 questions. I have Ariel Cohen and John Elkind, and then I'm going to have to close the questions up.
Ariel Cohen, the Heritage Foundation. The first question is to Amy on the volumes of investment that will be necessary to maintain the current Russian market share of gas in Europe and build the pipeline to China. Is it realistic where the money is going to come from? And if it's not going to happen, do you see all the alternative sources that you mentioned, Iran, Iraq, I would add Africa, as substituting the expanding gas market in Europe, substituting the potential Russian share? The second question is to everybody, and that is Ambassador Morningstar's quote about pipeline not being be-all and end-all. I understand it, but isn't it something that we say when we cannot push for a successful completion of these pipelines? And if these pipelines are not built, if you have upstream production, how and where this gas is going to go, and what are the alternatives, and why is it all of a sudden that we're not talking about Nabucco, for example, or about other potential projects? Does that mean all the gas will go to Russia? Thanks.
Jonathan Elkind, Brookings Institution. This question is for everybody except George. So, George, you're off the hook here. In a way, I'd like to kind of push to a crystallization one aspect of Ariel's question. Obviously, this is a time when lots of thought is going into how and whether policy of a new administration should be different than a policy of the previous administration. Ambassador Dredgen, you began your remarks by saying it was time for a departure, a different pipeline diplomacy. I'd be interested for those of you other than George to just give us a 2-sentence what was wrong with American diplomacy in relation to Caspian energy as it has been practiced to this point. Thank you.
Okay, let me start, and I'm just going to beg you all to go and read the Hartley-Metlock paper on natural gas, because it's a really interesting paper with some tremendously large number of scenarios. And we did a separate paper, which we presented in Turkey, that has 15 scenarios of how Turkey becomes a natural gas energy hub for Europe and so forth. But in 2 minutes, let me just say this. In natural gas, we have something called the first mover advantage. It means that if I get my infrastructure down first, I get the market, and you have to wait 10 years for the market to grow. So the Iranians lost the first tranche, and they lost the first tranche to the Russians. But to sort of grab up Ariel's question together with the other questions, there is this moment now about who's going to take this next tranche. And it could be a big tranche if we have carbon pricing, because in the end, we all know we're going to do some amount of renewable energy, but there's a limit to how fast and how large we can make that in a longer period of time. So in the short period of time, the easiest and simplest thing to do to be carbon less is to move more to natural gas and away from coal and oil. So the bottom line is, who's going to get this market? Who's the first mover? And in every case, it's billions of dollars. I mean, it's billions and billions of dollars. But if you just go with the straight model, because we have this model where we pretend there's no geopolitics first, and we just do it on the basis of the economics, and then we put on these geopolitical overrides and then show you how that affects that compared to the base run, the Iraqis win in the market. The Russians lose as long as Middle East producers step up to the plate with supply. But in the end, there's a lot of supply. There's Australia, there's, as you mentioned, North Africa, there's the U.S. I mean, we have so much shale gas, and the Canadians have so much shale gas. So one of the key questions is, will the Obama administration get U.S. tax policy right? Because we're talking about eliminating this IDC credit that little guys get, the little teeny-weeny mom-and-pop guys who went out and looked for shale gas in people's backyards. If we eliminate this IDC tax credit, a lot of those guys are going to go out of business, and maybe some of the majors will pick up the bigger properties, but we're going to lose the little properties. But ultimately, we're going to have to ask ourselves, if we have a favorable policy on natural gas in the United States, we could actually become an exporter. And we could be selling our gas against the Russians into Europe. So, but, will it be Iran if they make a negotiation with the international community? Will it be Iraq? I think the Iraqis understand the importance of trying to get out of the gate first, right? Qatar sees that they're going to have more competition, so that's why they're jumping around trying to find a replacement to the U.S. market, because the U.S. market, of course, is going to be supplying more and more domestic material. So, in a way, it's sort of an open ring, and that makes the geopolitics right now very fluid, and that is an incredibly good opportunity for U.S. diplomacy if we would get our minds around the fact that the whole supply system has changed, that the relations among these countries are open and changing, and we would step in, and instead of just doing the policy we've done for 20 years, we would recognize that the supply sources and the economics and the politics among all these different players has changed.
I want to throw in my fast two sentences to answer John's question. And I do have a policy brief outside that talks about some of this at length, and my paper in the series also looks at the Georgia and what it did or didn't change for these equations. I would say if we have had a flaw in the pipeline strategy, it's to have looked at the Eastern Caspian from the lenses of the Western Caspian. And what it takes to move Western Caspian oil and gas to Europe is fundamentally different than Eastern Caspian. And we have not seen, which I think is potentially there, down the road, the potential of competition, giving your first mover to market between Azerbaijani gas and Turkmenistan's gas. And we have not appreciated the economic costs, the short-term economic costs of moving East Caspian gas in ways that make Russia angry. So we have not offered developmental compensations for it. Secondly, and I think this is more important today, our strategy has to become more aware of the changing nature of the European market, and it has to be more forward-looking. It has to not look at supplying the European market of today solely, but ask the question whether this pipeline strategy is going to support the European market as it's being shaped and is likely to look at 2020 when these pipelines would be fully in place. You have the risk that you're going to strand the gas, especially the East Caspian gas, which is really acute. You also have the question of the current economics of gas production in the region. Are these pipelines viable at this point in time, given the low price of gas and the likelihood of that gas price, the risk of that gas price staying? That also occurs for the Kashagan timeline, so it's for some of the big oil projects too. So that's my 2 cents. On this topic, those of us in town, I really hope we can come back and talk about this again and use some of these pieces as a centerpiece for further discussion, as well as discussion on the European market. I want to give Ambassador Derision and Ambassador Kroll the chance to say anything they wish to add in closing, and we're so delighted that everybody joined us here today.
Well, in response to your question, you wanted a few words to answer your question on pipeline strategies. I would just say connect the dots. Everything you've heard from Amy, from Martha, from Ambassador Kroll, what I said, is that one of the reasons the pipeline strategies have been so deficient is that we haven't connected the dots. And I hope the Obama administration will connect the dots in terms of the fundamental gas and oil hydrocarbon factors that Amy and Martha have talked about, the challenges we face in Central Asia. And what I said is that basically you cannot look at these pipeline strategies in isolation of some of the greater conflict, regional conflict and conflict resolution issues we have in the region. Let's face it, when the previous administration was really lobbying for the Baku-Jehan line, it was done in a way that's really equivalent to NATO expansion in the way Russia saw it. This was an anti-Russian move. And so we need to get into a strategic dialogue with Russia. That's a primary goal, as we must with China and other major powers. But at the same time, we have to look at the conflicts in the region. I mentioned, Georgia. There's Nagorno-Karabakh, the Armenian-Azeri relationship, the Turkish-Armenian relationship, the relationships that the administration is forging with the Central Asian states. Connect the dots.
Просто я согласен. But also just on the matter of the Dick Morningstar's comment about pipelines, again, as he was saying, it's only a part of the puzzle, but it's a part that is important that needs to be dealt with. So it has to be dealt in whole with upstream development and all the issues that Ambassador Dirigian raised as well. So thank you.
I want to thank you all for coming and thank our guests from Houston. Thank you so much.